I'm Gary L. Wolfe. The only reason I use the L is not to be confused with the World Wrestling Gary Wolfe when Googled. This painting is somewhat out of context, and I'll be interested in hearing from you whether it works out of context. It's part of a larger group and installation that I'm working on called Who Told You That You Were Naked, which is a series of figures and portraits, figures on vertical rectangles, portraits on circles to echo binary code. And the installation is about looking and being looked at, which includes not only the paintings, but also technology, surveillance cameras, and video monitors that are embedded in the paintings. So the art is looking back at you, but this portrait is looking back at you. And it's all about our looking and being looked at in this culture. I was thinking of the story in Genesis where Adam and Eve, after taking the fruit, hide from God, walking in the garden, and God confronts them and said, "Why did you hide?" Adam says, "We were naked." God asks this question, "Who told you that you were naked?" And was that about shame? Was it about a changed consciousness? What is the story trying to communicate? About the time I'm thinking of this, Ed Snowden lets us all know that the NSA is all watching all of us. So we are all virtually naked with no place to hide. That sense of vulnerability and that sense of both voyeurism and exhibitionism intrigued me, especially in light of the video nature of our culture. We all have a cell phone, we're all taking selfies, we're all videoing one another. Some of the information here will end up online for everybody to see. The other part of this installation is that I'm very interested in combining the notion of video, which is an ongoing narrative, an ongoing set of images, and painting, which is a discrete vignette, a static image, because we live our lives kind of in this notion of these moments and then the larger story. And so I try to create that viewing experience with some of these installations. So okay, so that gives you the ground, but I'm more interested really in what you have in terms of feedback and questions with regard to the piece, because I learn a lot from what you see. So.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but the round frame, the composition in the circle puts a real focus on, what we talked about, being looked at and looking out.
Thank you, yeah.
Is that on purpose, the round frame?
I think it's serendipitous because I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it, but yes, the circles, were the round was just to reference the zeros and ones of binary, but your point is well made. It does kind of create a focal point.
It sure does.
Both in terms of you looking and the portrait looking out at you.
Do you know your subject? Is this someone you know?
Yes, all the paintings are people I know.
Can you talk a little bit about your decision to have the flat grid in the background?
The grid. So when I entered into this project, part of the grid was my artist's tool, to manage proportions. And then the grid became this visual element, and I started thinking about the grid. And the grid in the journey has come to mean, for me, all the ways that human beings are reduced to numbers, all the ways that we're measured. How much does it cost to have this medical procedure? What is the percentage of poverty here? We're talking about human beings, and human beings defy the numbers. We're much more complex than numbers, and the figures you'll see in this are breaking through the grid, and these portraits are all placed in front of the grid, and so this grid is basically the matrix, the construct that we live in. I think Tony referenced it in the ways we are made to behave within the grid. All of that is measured, and it's about control. And so I'm just pointing it out. I'm not saying that the grid is a bad thing. I'm just saying that sometimes the grid so subsumes the human that we are oppressed and subject to the grid rather than in front of it.
If you're, directing the viewer to the idea of us being surveyed and becoming sort of, bits of information, I wonder if you've considered, rather than doing like a high realist portrait as you've done, breaking down the portrait further into, and you've already got the grid in the background, into more of a pixelated form, or something like, or even partially, not even entirely, but something that would more overtly suggest the theme that you're referring to? Because that's a painterly device as well.
Yes, and Chuck Close has used it
Sure,
quite well.
yeah.
And and John, it's something to put in my database. But this is the way I paint right now, and it's kind of progressing. It'll progress from here, and I understand the tension. And part of my sensibility is drawn to a somewhat classical sense of painting. That being said, it references past, and I try to reference present in how I contextualize it. Anybody else? Grazie.
Thank you.
Yeah.